Hi, everybody! Sometimes a single phone call is enough to change everything. On an ordinary day that was meant to pass quietly, an unexpected ring shattered the silence, bringing news about Toan that no one was prepared to hear. In that brief moment, time seemed to stop, and every breath became heavy with fear and hope intertwined. As the words traveled through the phone, Lytudiep felt her heart tremble, while Fu could no longer hold back her tears. Memories rushed back like a storm, love once promised, pain once buried, and a name that still carried too much meaning. Was this call a sign of healing or the beginning of another heartbreak? Because when emotions resurface without warning, even the strongest hearts can break, and sometimes they break just to remember how deeply they once loved. The afternoon arrived quietly, like so many others before it. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of the small living room, painting soft patterns on the worn wooden floor. Lytudiep sat by the window, folding freshly washed clothes with careful, almost mechanical movements. Outside, the sounds of daily life drifted in, vendors calling out their goods, motorbikes passing by, laughter echoing somewhere down the street. Everything felt painfully normal. Thu stood near the kitchen doorway, stirring a pot of soup that had been simmering for too long. The aroma filled the room, warm and familiar, yet it did nothing to ease the heaviness in her chest. Silence stretched between the two women, not awkward, but heavy with unspoken thoughts. It was the kind of silence shared by people who had waited for too long, hoped for too much, and learned to lower their expectations just to survive. Toan's name was not mentioned, yet it lingered everywhere. In the empty chair at the table, in the unanswered questions, in the way Lytudiep's eyes often drifted toward the door, as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. Life had taught her how to continue moving forward, but it had never taught her how to stop waiting. Some nights she told herself she was strong enough to accept the uncertainty. Other nights she clutched her phone in the dark, wondering if fate had already decided his ending without her consent. Tu watched Lytudiep from across the room, her heart tightening with quiet concern. She knew that look too well, the fragile calm of someone who pretended to be fine. They had searched, asked, waited, and prayed until exhaustion became routine. And now, all that remained was this fragile peace, built on the belief that not knowing was somehow safer than knowing the worst. The phone lay on the table between them, screen dark and silent. It had become an ordinary object, yet also a terrifying one. Every unexpected ring had the power to shatter their fragile balance. Still, day after day, it remained quiet, reinforcing the illusion that maybe this was how life would be from now on, unfinished, unresolved. Lytudiep exhaled softly and folded the last shirt. Just another day, she told herself. Just another quiet afternoon. She had no idea that somewhere, unseen threads were tightening, preparing to pull her life in a direction she never dared to imagine. And when the phone finally rang, it would not simply deliver news. It would break open the past, awaken buried hope, and change everything they thought they had accepted. The ringing came suddenly, sharp, insistent, unforgiving. Lytudiep froze, her fingers still gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the room. For a brief, fragile second, she wondered if she had imagined it, if her heart had betrayed her again. But the sound rang out once more, louder now, cutting through the quiet afternoon like a blade. Hu turned off the stove without thinking. The soup bubbled over, hissing in protest, but neither of them noticed. Their eyes were locked on the phone resting between them, its screen glowing with an unfamiliar number. Time slowed, stretching each heartbeat into something heavy and unbearable. "Answer it," Hu whispered, though her voice trembled. Lytudiep swallowed. Her hand hovered over the phone, shaking slightly. She had answered countless calls before, each one ending in disappointment, confusion, or silence. Somewhere deep inside, a voice warned her to stay still, to let it stop ringing, to preserve what little peace she had left. But another voice, louder and braver, urged her forward. She pressed the screen. "Hello?" Her voice came out softer than she intended. On the other end, a man spoke carefully, as if choosing each word could determine the weight of her fate. He introduced himself, his tone professional, distant, yet tinged with urgency. Diem listened, nodding unconsciously, even though no one could see her. Then a name surfaced through the static. Toan. The world seemed to tilt. Her knees weakened, and she sank into the chair behind her, the phone pressed tightly against her ear. The man continued speaking, about a report, a sighting, a photograph that had circulated, about a man who matched Toan's description, alive, injured, confused, found far from where he was last seen. Tu covered her mouth, tears spilling freely before she even understood why. She had been strong for so long, telling herself not to hope, not to imagine. But hope, it turned out, was stubborn. It waited quietly, patiently, for the smallest crack to slip through. Diem could barely breathe. Every word felt unreal, like a dream she was afraid to wake from. She asked questions, too many, too fast, her voice breaking despite her effort to remain composed. The call ended not with certainty, but with possibility, and somehow that was enough to undo her completely. When the screen finally went dark, the room felt different. The air was heavier, yet brighter. Tears fell without restraint, not from sorrow alone, but from the overwhelming shock of a truth they had long buried. Toan might still be out there. And for the first time in years, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of trembling hope. The house did not return to silence after the call ended. Instead, it filled with quiet sobs, broken breaths, and the unsteady rhythm of two hearts struggling to keep pace with what they had just heard. Lytudiep still held the phone in her hand, as if letting go might erase everything. The screen had gone dark, but the echo of Toan's name lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable. She pressed her palm against her chest, trying to calm the storm rising inside her. Memories came flooding back without warning. His voice on early mornings, the warmth of his presence in crowded places, the way he used to glance back to make sure she was still walking beside him. She had buried those moments deep, convincing herself they were safer left untouched. Now they surged forward, vivid and painful, refusing to be ignored. Tu moved closer and wrapped her arms around Diem. The embrace was tight, desperate, as if they were holding each other upright against the weight of years lost to waiting. Tu's tears soaked into Diem's shoulder, each one carrying regret, guilt, and relief tangled together. She whispered apologies she had rehearsed 1,000 times, sorry for not finding him sooner, sorry for the days she doubted, sorry for learning how to live without answering him anymore. Only questions remained. Where had Toan been all this time? What had he endured alone? Did he remember them? Or was he walking through the world as a stranger to his own past? The thought sent a quiet fear through her chest. Hope was beautiful, but it was also cruel. It promised everything and guaranteed nothing. She wiped her tears and stood, walking slowly toward the window. Outside, life continued without pause. A child chased a ball down the street. A neighbor hung laundry under the fading sun. The world had not stopped for their heartbreak. And yet, for Diem, everything had shifted. She imagined Toan somewhere unfamiliar, waking each day with fragments of memories he could not name. The idea made her ache. Love, she realized, did not disappear just because time passed or distance grew. It waited. It endured. It remembered, even when the mind could not. Thu joined her by the window, their shoulders brushing. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. In that quiet moment, surrounded by ordinary life, they understood something profound. Tears were not a sign of weakness, but of hope returning after a long, painful exile. Whatever came next, answers or disappointment, they would face it together. And for the first time in years, the future no longer felt like an endless, empty road. It felt uncertain, fragile, and alive. That night, sleep refused to come. Lytudiep lay awake, staring at the ceiling as shadows slowly shifted with the passing hours. Every sound felt louder than usual: the ticking clock, the distant hum of traffic, the wind brushing against the window. Her mind replayed the phone call again and again, clinging to every word as if repetition could turn uncertainty into truth. Somewhere out there, Toan was breathing under the same sky, and that thought alone made her heart ache with longing. At dawn, the world outside began to stir. Vendors rolled open their stalls, footsteps echoed in the alley, and a scent of morning coffee drifted through the air. Life moved forward, unaware of the quiet storm unfolding inside her. Diem rose from bed and watched the sunrise paint the horizon in soft gold. It felt symbolic, almost cruel, so beautiful for a day that carried so much fear and hope intertwined. Thu joined her silently, handing her a warm cup of tea. Their eyes met, and no words were needed. They both knew this was no longer a story about waiting. It was a story about choosing to move, even when the ground ahead was uncertain. Plans began to form, not clearly, not confidently, but with determination. They would follow every lead, make every call, travel any distance. This time, hope demanded action. Throughout the day, Diem found herself noticing small things she had once overlooked: the sound of laughter on a bus, a couple walking hand in hand, a man standing still at a crossroads, unsure which way to go. Each moment felt like a mirror, reflecting pieces of her own journey. Life, she realized, was made up of these ordinary scenes, yet hidden within them were turning points that could change everything. As evening fell, she held Toan's old photograph in her hands. His face, frozen in time, felt both familiar and distant. She traced the edge gently, her heart whispering promises she didn't know if he could hear. If fate truly existed, then it was no longer dormant. It had awakened, quietly, persistently, pulling invisible threads tighter with every passing hour. Somewhere, a chain of events had already been set in motion. A photograph passed from hand to hand. A memory stirred where it had once been lost. A man paused, feeling an ache he could not explain. And a woman, standing at the edge of hope, prepared herself to step forward once more. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with unanswered questions and fragile expectations. But Diem understood one thing with absolute clarity: love does not fade simply because time has been cruel. It waits, and when the moment is right, it calls out, softly at first, then louder, until destiny can no longer ignore it.